Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who is on this webinar today with us today. I wanted to first thank you all for taking the time out of your morning to learn more about what we have to share today. My name is Jordan, and I'm going to be your moderator, for today's webinar. I run Sales here at Spot, which is a tool that helps employees speak up about workplace harassment and discrimination. So why this topic? As we were talking to customers and industry leaders about this topic, we were hearing time and time again that employees needed help speaking up about inappropriate behavior in the workplace. And what we decided is that, this signaled to us that this is an area that needs some attention and some structured thinking around it. And as I sat with our team here, we've identified what we think are the top barriers to reporting harassment and discrimination, and most importantly, how AI can help. So before we do begin, I have 3 quick requests. If you do have questions along the way, just type them into the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. We're going to have a quick Q&A session in the last 10 to 15 minutes that we do have today. 2, if you have any issues getting set up or installing the software, please let me know right away. Or you can shoot me a text at 650-684-8021. And 3, most importantly, I know everyone here is accustomed to using Slack or email, Gmail, or Outlook. Please close whatever application that you are using. I would hate for you guys to miss some of the great stuff that we're going to be covering today. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Julia Shaw, who's the co-founder of Spot, and Dr. Camilla Elphick, who's the head of research, who both will be sharing their insights today. So let's get to it, and over to you, Camilla.
Thanks so much, Jordan. Yeah, so just a little bit about me. My background is in witnesses, so I'm really interested in witness recognition, witness memory, and the way that witnesses recall events they've experienced. And I'm particularly passionate about Spot because one of my greatest passions is applying psychological research to real-world findings. So it seems like the perfect fit for me. Over to you.
And I'm one of the co-founders of Spot, so my expertise also lies in memory, and in particular what fascinated me in the early days of Me Too was how there was a lot of discussion around harassment and discrimination as a big problem, but the tools didn't seem to actually offer both the communication styles that were necessary, and they didn't really offer a very good way to preserve contemporaneously evidence. So as someone who works as an expert in court, I'm often the one to come in and critique memories and to say that the quality of particular memory evidence isn't good enough. And unfortunately, in harassment cases, often people have inadequate evidence because they don't really know how to record things. And so for me, Spot is a really exciting opportunity to create a tool that people actually use where they can immediately preserve their memory of what happened, and they can share it with their organization, with HR, in a way that is really useful both to them and to the organization. So I think it's for me, a really exciting application of memory science to a very real world issue, like Camilla was saying. So I'm looking forward to sharing and getting into the deck with you. So let me start the deck. And here we are. So in terms of the topics that we're going to be covering in this webinar, what we really want to focus on is both a literature review that we did over the past year and a half, where we looked at the wider body of knowledge on harassment and discrimination, and our own research at Spot, where we work both with Camilla and we work with Rashid, who's also a PhD in related research. And we've really been investigating what is going on and how much harassment is really happening in our workplaces and how do we prevent it from happening. And as an additional piece, I think that AI in particular has a really big role to play in potentially tackling this issue. So you'll see throughout this presentation that there's a number of threads, and one of those main threads is that we think that one of the main barriers to reporting harassment in the workplace is that people have to often sit in front of a human being and tell their story. And it's a really difficult experience because if you have just experienced something or experienced something a long time ago and you have to share that emotional story with somebody else, there's a lot of trust that needs to be there. There's a lot of sensitivity. You might not feel comfortable. You might feel like you're not being believed. There's lots of different things at play. Even if HR or the person who you're talking to is a really nice person, it can still be a very difficult thing to get up the courage to talk to those individuals. And even when you get there, sometimes those individuals also come with their own biases and preconceived notions as to what, for example, a truth teller looks like. And unfortunately, research shows us that also, we're not very good at actually detecting whether someone's telling the truth or not, and we over-rely on bad cues. So how do we remove the bias? How do we make the experience better and remove the barriers to reporting? So AI, we think, can help by making the process easier and safer for employees. So the 4 things that we'll be talking about in this webinar are, first, who actually experiences harassment and discrimination? What are the statistics? We've gone through the last almost 20 years of research.
Yeah, that's right.
To summarize the research that we think is high quality and to give it to you so that you don't have to. Second, what are the consequences? What are the psychological consequences for the individual who's experienced the harassment or discrimination? And what are the consequences for the employees and the employers around them? So the health of an organization. What are the barriers to reporting and how can they be overcome is third. So what are the actual barriers that we identify and that others have identified? And fourth, how can we proactively improve workplace culture? And that is probably going to be, after we've educated you on all the issues we think are most important, the single most useful piece of this webinar at the very end, to summarize proactively, how do you deal with this? So Camilla.
Thanks, Julia. Yes, so first of all, we wanted to ask the question, who experiences harassment and discrimination? And you probably think, oh no, not this again. We've seen this so many times. Why are they doing the research again? Well, we think this is the right time to be doing this kind of research, and particularly in the wake of Me Too, and also with the advent of new technologies that gives us new opportunities to test it in different ways. So I'm sure we've all heard of Me Too, and it's really highlighted the issues with harassment, the scale of it, and the issues with harassment reporting. And this indicates that the true figures have probably long been obscured. The problem with Me Too is it also hides the figures surrounding men and transgender individuals who aren't represented by it. And the other thing about Me Too, it doesn't represent non-sexual harassment. And so we feel that these are 2 areas we really need to look at properly as well. So our research combines previous research and our own AI report, which is brand new data, and I'll talk a bit about that in a little minute. But what we did find was that the AI data clarified points for making really positive changes to workplaces, which Julia will talk to you about at the end. So I wanted to start first with some figures for you, and this is taken from previous research. So the top 2 are related to sexual harassment. The one on the left says that 60% of women have experienced sexual harassment at some point, and the one on the right says that 90% of women have experienced it. Now this one specifies the restaurant or hotel industry, the service industry. So why are these 2 figures so different? Well, we think the one on the left, it was a good study, but we think maybe it's conservative because it happened before Me Too. But then you might argue, well, so did the one on the right. That was also before Me Too. Why are the figures so different? Well, we think people in the service industry probably are doubly vulnerable because they not only may experience harassment from their colleagues and their co-workers, but also from clients and customers. And this is what they reported. So you can see here the discrepancy just in the situation with sexual harassment. And then I'll now look at the 2 figures at the bottom. On the left, you've got 65% of people of colour have experienced racial harassment in the last year, also done before Me Too. Now, what's interesting about this is the only study that discussed the prevalence, and actually gave us a figure, prevalence of racial harassment discrimination. But we had to take this data from a study which looked at university students because we couldn't find anything about this in the workplace. My conclusion is if there are 65% of people experiencing racial harassment at university level, well, it's likely that there's probably a similar figure in the workplace, but why is there no data to reflect that? And the one on the right, 97% of LGBTQI plus individuals, where this shocking figure suggests that all these people have experienced some form of workplace harassment at some point. Now, this may seem surprisingly large to you, but actually this is the start of a large body of new work into this field. And unfortunately, it seems that this figure does actually reflect what is going on. So as you can see from the slide, although sexual harassment does occur, so do other forms of harassment discrimination, which are generally underrepresented in previous research and in the media. So the other thing I want to talk to you about was our own AI research. Now, we have a reporting tool that's available for anybody to use online. It's free, it's easy to access, you don't need to log in or register. And it's for witnesses and victims of harassment discrimination to report what's happened or what they've experienced in their own words. Now, you're probably wondering why we've got this, why we have these reports. Well, each user has complete control over their level of anonymity, and the vast majority of people don't share their research with us. But at the end of making a report, people do have the option of sharing their report with us for research purposes. They have to give their informed consent. So those who have kindly done so have given us this data that we are now sharing with you. And at the time of making these slides, we had 152 spot reports that we could use. So from these spot reports, we found that the data was far more nuanced than the survey data. And this is really because people were able to describe what was happening to them in their own words. They weren't constrained by a list of choices. What type of harassment have you experienced? Tick this box. They could say what happened to them in their own words. And we found from this report that while sexual harassment was the most common, 24% of people who used our tool reported that they had experienced sexual harassment. 15% said they'd experienced racial harassment, and 61% complained about some other inappropriate behaviour. So while sexual harassment was the most common, it clearly isn't the only kind of harassment discrimination that's going on, as it only reflects a quarter of the reports that we had. So we feel that workplaces really need to reflect this in the kind of policies, procedures and messages that they're giving to their workforce. So over to you, Julia.
Yeah, I mean, there's one of the key messages I think that we've certainly been trying to spread is that it's time to broaden the conversation beyond sexual harassment. It's a really important thing to discuss sexual harassment, but we must be more inclusive. We need to make sure that we have policies and ways of reporting all kinds of experiences, because otherwise we're never going to arrive at a diverse workforce. And I think that the other thing that for me has become increasingly apparent is that intersectionality can also be an issue in terms of how we collect data. Mm-hmm. And so it can be difficult, for example, to know why you are being harassed if you tick a number of boxes in your protected characteristics. So you might, for example, be a person of color who's also openly lesbian, who's also, well, a woman. And so you don't necessarily know why someone, or based on which of those characteristics someone is harassing you on. And it might be all three. But how do we capture those kinds of intersectional experiences? And I think the only answer is to have tools that actually capture all of those and don't just focus on sexual harassment. So the other thing is that, for me at least, surprisingly, in our literature review, we were repeatedly finding that the industries that were most problematic were actually not the ones that we often hear about. So it's not just happening in Hollywood. It's not happening in tech. There's been a lot of talk about tech. It's actually happening more in lower power and also more shift work positions. So things like in the restaurant industry, service industry, frontline workers are particularly affected by these issues. And yet they seem to still not be joining the conversation or able to join the conversation in the same way. So making sure as well that we include different kinds of work situations in as well as different kinds of harassment and discrimination. So the other thing that we are interested in, or one of the other things, is what are the consequences? So there's two main types of consequences. The first are direct costs. And these are things that you can often effectively put a number on. You can put a $ sign on them or a pound sign, depending on what part of the world you're in. Direct costs in a literature review of 42 studies, which from a scientific point of view is a strong study. Again, before Me Too, but still, there has been research, just not as much as we'd like on this topic for a long time. But even then, they were finding that things like a loss of productivity, not being able to perform your job as well, more obvious and sort of maybe apparent costs, like increased legal costs. If things get litigious, then there's a cost associated with potentially going to court, which is the worst case scenario for really everyone, because by that point, something's really got out of hand. The healthcare costs for the individual, so if you have depression or anxiety or other symptoms directly from that situation, you might need to pay to actually get more support. An increased need for training. Quite often the first thing that organizations try to do if a situation arises is that they will try to organize some sort of training, and of course there's always money attached to that. And finally, of course, increased turnover, people leaving because they feel harassed out of a workplace, and costs to reputation. So broader knock-on effects, both in terms of potentially press reputation, which is something we've been seeing a lot lately, but more likely, someone leaving who's been harassed is going to tell other people. They are going to, when their friends ask them, what was it like working at your organization, they're going to say, actually, you know what, it was really bad. And so that would limit your opportunities to find really highly qualified individuals, especially diverse candidates, to join your organization in the first place, never mind to retain them. So those are the direct costs that we're finding. But there's also a bunch of indirect costs. And these are often more psychological, and they have to do with things like depression. So being depressed because of the situation, because of ongoing or one-off harassment, related to that post-traumatic stress disorder, blood pressure issues, so especially if you already suffer from maybe poor health, that can exacerbate existing issues, and broader sleeplessness, insomnia, stress. Now, this is all from surveys and from various data sets that have been taken from often limited answer pools. So you are given a sort of set amount of answers that you're able to click on, and that limits your response. And it limits, understandably, like you were saying before, the nuance and the depth of the information you're going to get. And so when we had these spot reports in front of us and we looked at the consequences that people were able and willing to tell our AI about, we got a much richer picture. And so here are some of the ones that we found. We found that things like disappointment or humiliation, a quarter of people mentioned this directly. Now that doesn't have a dollar sign attached to it as easily, but you could easily see how that affects morale and makes a toxic workplace. When asked how did it affect your well-being after the event, people reported even later things like fear or shock. Again, also further reinforcing previous findings, things like insomnia or sleeplessness. So really broad-ranging things that can last for a really long time and really affect performance and mental health. This also reflecting quotes that we got, things like, I had a breakdown, or I finally decided to quit, or I became quieter, not trusting, fearful that something else would happen. So the fear can transfer, it can transfer into various situations, it can transfer in how they interact, sort of in a learned helplessness style. They might become quiet, reserved, and withdrawn, and you might not know why, and that might be because they haven't felt comfortable telling you that they're actually being harassed and that they need help. Now, the thing I find possibly most interesting about this category of research is that it's really easy to look at these consequences and go, well, obviously people are going to be disgusted. Maybe if they've experienced sexual harassment, they might be disgusted by that individual. If they're racially harassed at work, they might become fearful or angry about other individuals at work. If they are discriminated against because of other factors like pregnancy, they might lose trust in the organization more generally. These all seem obvious, but what's not obvious is that quite often that consequence has little to do with the actual situation. As in, it's not experiencing harassment. It's not something bad happened. It's usually something bad happened and my organization either didn't respond or I didn't feel safe telling them and they couldn't respond. So it's really the response and the isolation and lack of support that seems to cause these kinds of long-term, especially psychological consequences. So to me, that was absolutely fascinating because it's not the fact that harassment happens. It is always going to happen. If you have enough people in an organization, unfortunately, occasionally, harassment and discrimination are going to happen. What matters and what you can control even more than educating people is figuring out how to deal with it when it does happen and how to maximize the response to minimize the consequences. So there's research to back this up from even quite a long time ago already, is that if a workplace handles a formal report well, an individual will not suffer from ill health or bad career consequences that stem from the harassment or discrimination. It's your response that really matters, and you can do a lot to help people with these situations. Despite this, almost 75% of people do not report. So in some research actually shows even higher percentages. Again, this seems to be possibly a conservative estimate, sort of midway between different studies that we found. But most of the time, if you see or experience harassment or discrimination, you don't speak up. And we'll talk about some of the barriers next. And to help you with that, why do people not tell us about these things despite all the negative consequences? Back to Camilla.
Thanks, Julia. Yes, so this is what I'm going to be talking about. And I'm sure you've all seen lists like this. These are very common barriers to reporting that have been reported over and over again. I want to talk to you about 4 of them very, very briefly. So the first one, fear of not being believed. And I also want to talk about feel it's embarrassing to report, the third one down. Now, these were supported by an experiment actually we conducted with Spot last year. We got participants to look at a sexual harassment video and then record it using a Spot-like tool. Basically, we mimicked Spot in a research tool, and we asked them to write down what they'd seen. At the end of doing so, we also asked them what they felt about recording such an event to AI as opposed to reporting it to a human being. And what we found was that overwhelmingly, the people who used this tool really preferred using the AI to a human. Mm-hmm. They wanted to report these kinds of things to a human because they felt that humans could be judgmental, biased, and not believe them. And also, particularly if they had experienced sexual harassment with degrading and revolting behaviour, they did not want to talk about it in front of somebody they knew, or maybe didn't know. I mean, either way, they just didn't want to speak to a human, particularly if they had to report to somebody of a different gender. Mm-hmm. Overwhelmingly, they said they could only really express exactly what had happened to them using a tool like AI. The other 2 things I want to talk about are the second one down. They did not know how to report. People often didn't even know if there was a reporting mechanism in place, or they did not know the anti-harassment policy, and again, or if there was even an anti-harassment policy in place. So we know that having a good reporting tool and having a good anti-harassment policy in place is so important, but so too is making them accessible to your employees. So employees need to be able to know where they are, how to find them. They need to be shown explicitly how to use them. And why not give new employees the opportunity to play with a reporting tool so they're familiar with how to use it should they need it in the future? Because the one thing they don't want to do is have to find out how to use it if they want to make an anonymous report.
And let's be honest, during induction, when someone is first joining a company, there's a lot of information, and it's really easy to forget that if something happens later on.
It needs to be clear and accessible.
Yeah.
We then back this up with our AI reports again, and we found the first themes were really around power and fear. And this was best represented when looking at research that involved directors. Now, alarmingly, 94% of the reports that involved directors also involved sexual harassment. It seemed that directors were making the most or creating opportunities to be alone with employees that had a lower hierarchical rank, or they used opportunities at social events to harass them. The main point being they used their physical presence and enclosed spaces to exert their power physically over the person and to make them feel trapped and fearful. But also this fear and sense of powerlessness transcended beyond the actual experience into what happened next. People were too afraid to report because of fear of retaliation and victimization, and they felt powerlessness because, of course, the person who was harassing them was so important to the organization, they really had nowhere to go. And unfortunately, we had a lot of really explicit and detailed quotes that people did when they were talking about what had happened to them, which actually explains that people were fine talking about what had happened to them to an AI tool. They went into great depth. And we actually struggled to find a quote that we could give you that wasn't too explicit or graphic, but we found one we think sums up the kind of sense of entrapment and fear that people might experience. No one else was in the room, and because of the computer, no one could see us. I was suddenly aware of him stood right behind me, rubbing himself into my behind. So as I said, there were a lot more of these, and a lot of them were a lot worse. The second thing that we felt was really key as a barrier to reporting was the issue of managers. So not only were they most commonly harassers, up to nearly 80% of reports stated that managers were harassers, but when people actually went to them for support and for at the start of a reporting process, in 37% of the reports that we got, people said that their managers didn't do anything about it. So that's meant that HR was unable to act because they didn't know about it. So very quickly, just going through 3 quotes which express this quite well. Most are afraid to talk. Everyone knows, but all are afraid to act or help. So this is fear again. And then nothing has been done again. This came up over and over again. People just felt ignored for one reason or another. Managers are too busy, or they're complacent. And the third one, management are complicit in protecting the person available. Now this came up often if the perpetrator was really important to the business or in small family businesses. And I just wanted to quickly touch on this because even though it's not directly related to barriers of reporting, I think a really, really important aspect of reporting in general, it's about witnesses. Of course, I'm interested in that. Now, we got the impression from our previous research that all harassment was going on behind closed doors, and this is why workplaces didn't believe they had a problem with it. But we were shocked to find that 60% of the report said that there had been witnesses present, sometimes multiple witnesses, but 93% of people who sent us reports said the witnesses didn't report it. Now, this is a big problem because we know that the consequences of harassment and discrimination are actually contagious. It spreads throughout. And also, if witnesses don't report, it really puts all the pressure on the victim to do something about it, and it further isolates them. So this is something that we think is important. And finally, just before I pass you back to Julia, we asked people who are using the AI reporting tool, what should your organization do to prevent this kind of situation in the future? And we found overwhelmingly that people really wanted to be proactive, and there was no avenue for them to do so, to make any changes to their organization. And these are the three main things that came up. People want accountability. They want an automatic system that can investigate the situation immediately. They wanted transparency. This person said they have a house policy but no oversight. So it's no good having a policy if you're not going to use it. And the third one was targeted training. People really were against general random training. They wanted, for example, managers to get people skills training or directors to get sexual harassment training. So I'm now going to pass you over back to Julia to talk about what we can do about all this.
So for me, that was a fascinating finding that the people themselves had a lot to say about what they thought an organization should do when you actually ask them. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that HR professionals often, that you guys ask people, that you of course want to know. But I think it can be something that's easy to forget. And making sure that that's always part of your questioning process, I think, is really helpful. And then actually, this is really important, following up and actually doing those things, at least in some form. With witnesses, I guess here as well, I agree so much that I think we need to broaden the discussion, broaden types of harassment we're talking about, broaden industries, but also bring in witnesses as allies. If we're building healthy workplaces, what we need to do is build a culture where people feel supported. They feel like other people are going to help if they get into trouble or if there's a situation that's negative that is going to impact them personally and in their careers. And so trying to educate people in your workplace that if they witness something, that they could go, for example, to the individual who they saw experience or targeted, the victim of the situation. They should go to them and say, hey, I saw that. Do you want to go speak up about it together, for example? So that's the kind of messaging that I feel like we're not really seeing right now. That is something that we could all benefit from sharing more widely and getting more witnesses involved, because that's going to help break down both the isolation and it's going to give you one other person who can inform you about what's actually happening in your workplace. So the question that this brings us to, and that we've collated all this information for you, and we want to now actually give you something useful to make real changes in your organization. So question 4, the final one, is how do we proactively improve workplace culture? I think some of the key things here are, well, lower barriers to reporting. There are a lot of barriers, and we went through quite a few of them. Every situation is different. Of course, there are even more for some, but we already understand that there's massive barriers. Most people don't speak up, and that needs to change. The second is, and we get asked this all the time by clients that we work with, is how do we identify serial offenders? Now, especially if those people are managers, this was also what I found really interesting, is that I think I would have underestimated how many of the harassers are managers. I think power is something that's difficult to understand, but I thought it was a bit more understood than that. Yeah, I would have expected managers to be more alive to these issues than I think, at least our reports are suggesting they actually are. But how do we identify people who people might be scared of talking about, people who have maybe ample opportunity to harass or discriminate, and how do we get people to speak up if there's, let's say, multiple individuals or multiple situations? And one way to do that is, again, to break down the barriers and to try and really identify those toxic individuals and remove them from the workplace, because that benefits everybody, or at least to educate them. Even if it's not removing individuals, it's changing their behavior and recognizing that they exist. The other thing is addressing smaller issues before they escalate. I think right now a lot of procedure is effectively around sort of something gets really out of hand, something legally meets, for example, the definition of harassment or discrimination, which first of all is different everywhere in the world. Second of all, is really difficult and is really hard to understand, certainly from a legal perspective. And what we really should be talking about is inappropriate workplace behavior. Someone feels something bad has happened, they would really like it to stop, or it's really important, or both to their well-being and to the organization that it stops, and they need help. And so whatever those are, you want people to come forward and tell you those things so that you can help them before, I like to use the expression, before the house is on fire. You want to catch the candle before it turns, catches the curtains and then the whole house goes down. You want to catch it in the early stages while you can still manage the situation. Everybody can leave the situation, hopefully with minimal consequences and happy, and you show that you can actually take action and elicit real change. So identifying and addressing those smaller issues before they become big ones, I think is a really, really big and meaningful thing to work on. And changing, I think, the culture around snitching. I think sometimes people feel like being a witness and speaking up about it is sort of snitching, is somehow letting the team down. Changing our expectations around that. I think we have a long way to go to do that, but I think we have to start now. And in line with this, in terms of empowering and giving more agency to individuals who want to speak up, there's some research by the EHRC last year which showed that if workplaces give people choices about who they want to report to, so that means potentially still offering a whistleblowing hotline if you have one, still offering an HR human being they can speak to, and maybe offering an online service or something that they can use anonymously in a different way. All of those are good to have because different people will have different ways that they want to communicate what's happened to them. But giving them choices really matters, and not just saying sort of, here's the one person and that person is your manager, which unfortunately quite often is the case. Having an anonymous reporting tool in place, they identified as one of the most critical things that we need to socially do. That organizations need a way for employees to report anonymously because so many people fear retaliation and they won't speak up otherwise. And now you've seen lists like this based on the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC guidelines in the US. There is this list, which I agree with, but I think is quite vague. So it's saying things like every organization should have a clear anti-harassment policy. Yes, but it's not just writing a good policy, it's also making it accessible. Second, an explicit statement of prohibited behaviors that can be considered harassment. So is sharing what the definition is, at least for your organization. What kinds of behaviors do you want people to report to you? Third, a complaint procedure that encourages employees to come forward with harassment complaints. It seems obvious. You want to encourage your employees to tell you when harassment happens. Fourth, protections for complainants and witnesses against retaliation. Now, in places like the United Kingdom, which is where we're currently sitting, that's just the law. You can't fire someone because they come forward with a harassment complaint. So that almost feels like a moot point, but it's suggesting that companies can go out of their way to really showcase the protections, that if people come forward, they're not going to suffer a lot of the consequences that they fear they might. And fifth, an investigative strategy that protects privacy interests. This actually touches on anonymity of both the alleged victim and the accuser and enables confidentiality to the extent possible. So I would agree with all of these things, and I think you should all take these on board. But possibly you're wondering what I think a lot of people are wondering is, how do we turn these vague guidelines into something practical? So here is an updated and more directive checklist based on our latest research and incorporating points where we think AI can be particularly effective. This is the one slide that you should probably keep. This is the one slide that you hopefully, possibly can take and actually apply in your organization and go through and see if you've addressed each one. Some you probably, hopefully already have, but some you probably haven't. And so you can really work towards a better structure to deal with these issues. So here's your checklist of all time based on our review of the literature. What can you do immediately to tackle workplace harassment in your organization? First, as Camilla mentioned earlier, have transparent policies and procedures. But don't just make sure that you have them, make sure they're easy to find. So 24/7, make sure they're online, make sure you remind people on a regular basis that they exist and where they can find them. You'd be surprised, perhaps, how many of your employees you ask, what is our policy and where can you find it? And how many of them would go, don't know. You don't want to be in that situation. Second, offer an online unbiased reporting option. Now, this can be an online Excel spreadsheet if you really want. It can be emails. It can be making sure that people have a way to get to you online. That's why we created Spot. Is we wanted to make sure people actually had an anonymous tool where they, are asked the right questions and it's structured. But there's ways of doing that without Spot that you can implement right away. What I want to add here is that if you have a whistleblowing hotline, that's great, except there's very little research to suggest that whistleblowing hotlines actually work. So you might be one of the organizations, like the ones that we often talk to, that effectively say, you know what, we get a couple of calls to our whistleblowing hotline a year, and that's it. And when we're talking about big organizations, a couple of calls is probably not representative unfortunately, of real harassment and discrimination that's happening. It means that low numbers don't mean that you don't have harassment. It just means that people are probably not telling you about it. So whistleblowing, it's awkward to pick up the phone and talk to a stranger and tell them your emotional situation. And it's even worse if you're calling someone in your own workplace. So third party here, I think, is really important as well. Third, encourage contemporaneous digital evidence. This makes cases stronger. Now, as memory scientists, this is particularly close to our hearts, is that you should, I think, inform and educate your employees, even in a very basic way, that the evidence that they bring to you matters. Because I think a lot of people underestimate that they need evidence, for example, that when something happened, when they remembered something. And so sending yourself an email, something as simple as that, can make sure that you can prove, I remembered this close to the event, ideally the day it happened. And so really trying to get people to write things down at the time in as much detail as possible goes a really long way to both giving you more information and making their cases stronger and making your job to help them easier. Fourth, guaranteed anonymity for those who want or need it. Make sure that people who fear retaliation know that they can actually truly stay anonymous. Next, bypass managers and directors. Now, we've presented a number of statistics at this point, I think, that show that a sticking point often in the process is leadership, unfortunately. It's managers, it's directors, and the funnel seals and messages don't get passed on to the people whose job it is and who want to help and tackle these issues. So make sure that there's always direct access to HR. And I've recently been talking to some companies where, you look at their policy and it says, in a first instance, if you're being harassed, talk to your line manager. Don't have that clause in there. Make sure that there's a way around. Next, accountability within HR. Make sure that people don't have to tell their story over and over again. One organization we're working with specifically bought Spot because they had problems with handover. In HR, people come and go as well. People might move on to other countries or other opportunities, and that case that they're dealing with might need to be handed over to someone else in HR compliance. Now, what's really distressing is if you've experienced a negative workplace situation and you have to keep retelling the story. What you want is that first time, make sure you make really good notes, or you let them write it down in their own words, even better. And you really keep that record on file and you share it with your colleagues who are involved in that case, rather than having to get the person to over and over tell about the same thing. I mean, psychologically speaking, that's effectively, potentially re-traumatizing someone. Timeliness of response, quicker responses are better. No matter how trivial the complaint, people report much higher success and much higher health and satisfaction with the organization if you respond right away. Understandably. Let's say I've just submitted a report. The first thing I'm worried about is, where is this even going? Who's listening? And I want someone to, as quickly as possible, say, hey, we hear you, we're taking this issue seriously, and here are the next steps. So be transparent and make sure you respond to people as quickly as possible. Next, ability for those to report actually to elicit real change. This is something that emerged time and time again, right? Yeah. Is that people kept saying, for those who did speak up, nothing happened. Or I did speak up, but it wasn't what we needed. And so that, again, is massively demoralizing, to actually overcome all those barriers and then to be shut down and say, hey, but I can't actually change the structure. I can't fix this problem.
And after all the people who are being harassed are the experts.
Yes.
So listen to them.
Listen to them. It's hard enough for people to come forward. For the few who do, make sure you're there and you are actually taking it seriously. Here, I often hear excuses from HR. So when we first rolled out the feature of anonymous reporting, the first organizations we talked to said, well, we can't do anything with an anonymous complaint. Now, luckily, over the last year, that attitude, I think, has changed. And I think there's recognition that you simply have to have that capability. And if not, you're just going to be in the dark. So if you don't have an anonymous way to get to you, there are just going to be a lot of people who never tell you what's happening. And that's worse, in my opinion. And even if it's anonymous, even if it's vague, even if it's someone writing to you saying, there's a problem with management sexually harassing juniors, what can you do? You can at least send an email out. You can send out education. You can send out a video. You can send out definitions, examples of what not to do. You can do training. There's always something you can do. And that makes the individual who reported feel like they actually have the ability to change, and that if they report, something happens. Mm-hmm. And this is also contagious. Like if you're happy with the reporting process, you also tell others and say, this was a good experience. People listened, and here's what happened. Finally, the last two are similar to each other, but slightly separate. Particularly for managers, make sure you educate on people skills. Nobody said in their recommendations for what they think organizations should do that we want 1 hour of training on generally harassment and discrimination per year, which is I think for a lot of organizations, the default is we have this training session.
Tick box exercise.
Yeah, and that sounds negative, but I think it often is. It's a sort of, you don't really know what to do, so we're going to offer this one-size-fits-all training. Yeah. And one size doesn't fit all. And what people are actually asking for, at least in our reports, is they're asking for specialist things. So things like people skills. Like, how do you train managers specifically on how to set realistic deadlines and make sure that everybody works together better? Because that's often the underlying root of a lot of the things that lead to harassment and discrimination. And with managers and directors, sexual harassment is just such a big issue.
Yeah.
And so specifically for directors, not for everybody in the same way. I mean, everybody should also get some education, but maybe extra targeted education on power to directors and on sexual harassment specifically, because there's this, I think CEOs underestimate how much power they have sometimes. Mm-hmm. And they maybe don't understand that you're alone in a room with someone potentially, and just because of your role, you have different rules that apply to you. That person interacts with you differently, and you have different responsibilities because you have power whether you think you do or not. You have the ability to hire them, to fire them. You decide their salary, you have power. Mm-hmm. So making sure that that is crystal clear and that we're doing targeted training on that, not just general training. So those are the main things that I want you to take home with you. In terms of AI, you could probably guess at a couple of points where I mentioned Spot, where I think it's particularly useful. Tech in general, but specifically AI. I think initially, this was also a question that we kept getting was, well, why would people want to talk to an AI instead of a person? An AI can't be empathetic. Mm-hmm. We got this a lot. Like, you don't have someone sitting across from you, sort of nodding and being emotional and being supportive and maybe offering almost a therapeutic sort of atmosphere. And we realized very quickly that that's not the only thing that people need. People also want a place where they can go that's safe and anonymous and unbiased. Yeah. And they might also need therapy or someone else to emotionally support them, but those can be separate roles. And so they were telling us things that we don't think they would have been comfortable telling others.
Yeah, in regards to empathy, some people actually found talking to AI even better because they felt they didn't have fake empathy. Right. There wasn't a miscommunication. They could just use the tool for what it was there for.
Right, and it's there to problem solve, ultimately. Mm-hmm. Which I think, and again, people come with biases, and the buzzword unconscious bias, I think, has been around a lot recently. Sometimes they're very conscious biases as well, but you get around those. Yeah. And people know, and they're worried about how they're being perceived, and they have to manage these sort of presentation, and they don't have to with AI. So we think that the lower bias, on top of the ability to make sure it's the best possible memory interview, so it's evidence-based, best practices in memory interviewing. It's the first cognitive interview, which is best practices in those things from our disciplines. And it really generates the best evidentiary quality we could possibly create with a tool like this. Finally, lowering reporting thresholds and safer resolution of complaints, both related to anonymity and knowing that you're actually on the other side of a screen. And you can do it any time of day. You can do it without having to identify yourself. You can do it in just really sharing as much or as little as you feel comfortable. And you have direct communication channel with HR and compliance. So I'm hoping to see a lot more of AI in the future embedded into systems like this. I think they can really help. And I'm going to pass it back to Jordan.
Yeah. excuse me, I really think that this was a thorough overview on who experiences harassment, who does and who does not, and most importantly, why. And the fact that we are offering tactical steps to create an environment at your company where it's safe to speak up. Because again, the key here is just to make it safer for your employees to speak up about harassment and discrimination. So as we were going through this conversation, I asked you all if you guys had questions that you would like us to cover today. So we'll spend about 10 minutes of the time that we do have remaining on the questions that you guys do have. So let's dive in. And our first question is from Ben. And Ben's question is, how can we get smaller companies to embrace this over and above just a policy? In my experience, many small, like, mom and pop shops are not protecting workers. We know this is the right thing to do, but companies are not stepping up, especially in New York, where they're not mandating this by law. And is this the way to go?
Well, for the AI reports, we did see this was a big problem, that small family businesses did seem to discriminate against or harass the one person who wasn't a member of the family, because the connections and the relationships between all the members of the family were so complex. But I think, do you have any feedback as to what you think are the steps that people can take? Or with your experience, I don't have an answer to what the steps would be, but do you have anything?
Yeah, I think the biggest take-home message here is, from my point of view at least, is that I think quite often small businesses don't have, as far as I'm concerned, really any policy or procedure in place. And that's sort of understandable. As you grow, often you sort of forget that you need to add these things, and you often don't have a designated HR person, or you don't have sort of the same structures as a larger organization where they've been through this and they have legal requirements and things that small organizations don't. Now that's changing, and in lots of parts of the world, including different parts of the States, there are more laws that are mandating that all organizations have something, but it's quite slow. In the meantime, I do think that Spot specifically is a really useful tool for small businesses because it effectively gives you a universal system for dealing with this. Because Spot also has a feedback system where you can respond to anonymous complaints and a management system. So you effectively in one tool have all the different steps that you need, at least to deal with harassment and discrimination. Now, the role of the small business would be to then further educate your staff and to take that further and do proper training within your organization, both on the fact that they should use Spot and why. But I think that things like Spot are really helpful in solving that exact need. So I think that would be one of the steps. If you don't want to use Spot, and another step would be potentially to designate a person as the person who tries to implement as many of the things on that checklist that I shared earlier.
Yeah, and one thing I'd just like to add as well, I think just writing it down, even if your organization doesn't yet have the kind of system that you'd like to see as an individual, if you can just write it down, document things as much detail as you can with dates and times and things like that as well. At least a lot of people who used our Spot reports said that they actually find the process of writing it down was really cathartic. It really helped them to be able to express what was going on, even if unfortunately that was the only thing they could do. It's still worth writing it down.
Yeah. So encourage record keeping, both from an evidentiary perspective and from a psychological well-being perspective for your employees.
Awesome. Our second question is from David, and his question is, what core skills do you think managers need?
Well, again, Julia's, I think, touched on this earlier. One of the main skills was people skills. There were a lot of people who said that there were things like public belittling. So if one employee had done something wrong, the manager would choose a public space to criticize their work rather than just taking them to one side and saying, would you mind doing it a different way next time? So that was humiliating, and they felt very much publicly that they'd been redressed. They had issues, things like setting impossible tasks. So they would set people up to fail. If you give people very short deadlines or give them too much work to do, of course they're going to fail. And so I think it's expectations, people skills, also the expectations of managers. They need to manage their own expectations of what is possible. So those seem to be the things that I noticed in the EIA reports. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is not just the tip of the iceberg, not just training people on, again, harassment and discrimination as a catch-all trying to dig deeper and sort of look at what are the factors that have attributed to, if you have a particular situation you know of, what are the factors that you know might be at risk in your organization specifically. But how do we create a low stress environment, or at least an environment that is able to deal with these things? And so it's making sure that you think wider than just harassment and discrimination. And when you're thinking about training and you're thinking about skills, you think about them holistically as human interaction skills.
Yeah. So I think a lot of managers, they get their roles because they're particularly good at that job. So they get promoted because they're really excellent at the skill set they have. But it's also quite a difficult skill managing people, especially if you've had no experience before. So I think people do feel that a lot of people get management posts who actually can't manage, even though they're good at the other things they do in their job.
We have time for 2 more questions. Our next question is from Denise. If someone reports anonymously, then as HR, you investigate with the accuser, outlining the incident that it stops being anonymous. How does that work in practice, as cannot guarantee people being anonymous at that stage? What advice would you give?
So if I understand the question correctly, it's asking, so someone starts a process anonymously and then switches to not be anonymous. Is that how you interpreted it too, Jordan? Correct. So in those kinds of situations, well, for Spot, certainly that is something you can do. So at any point, the individual can identify who they are. It's just that at no point they're pressured to. So in Spot, you have the ability to first have a chat with the bot. At that point, you can, again, decide how much information you want to reveal or not. You can reveal your name. You don't have to. You can reveal the person who committed or who was the perpetrator of the particular harassment or discrimination or not. It's whatever you feel safe sharing. Now, HR can respond, or compliance, or whoever deals with these complaints can respond with another Spot chat. So you can select from a list of things that we've actually filtered to also be unbiased and in line with good interview practices. And you send those to the individual. They're back in the Spot AI chat. And there again, if you want, or if they want, they can identify themselves. But you're never going to be able to pressure them. Now, one thing we've had asked a lot is, what if I know that other people have come forward either complaining about the same individual or with similar kinds of complaints? And it would be really helpful because now we have 4 people with the same story to get one or all of them to speak up. And to identify themselves, because then you can do a more thorough and effectively even legal investigation into the situation. Now, for that, you could have as one of your questions, sort of saying, or more of a statement almost, if we are aware of similar kinds of incidents, if you are ready to identify yourselves, here's the person to talk to, or here's the person to go to. So it's, again, never ever pressuring people, because I think people will disengage as soon as you do that. But always reminding people that you're going to have a better and more thorough investigation if they do identify themselves, and making it clear that certainly things like firing people, you can't do that based just on an anonymous complaint. And if that's what they think needs to happen, they need to identify themselves. So being clear. It's an effective managing expectations about what you can and can't do.
Yeah, and for people who really don't want to identify themselves at any stage, they can remain anonymous throughout. And there are still steps that workplaces can do, because we kind of feel that we want to change workplace cultures rather than forcing people to come forward.
Right.
So if an organisation just gets a report with 3 keywords saying sexual harassment, or I don't know, what something else, they can still act on it, as you said, with tech training or with videos or I don't know, other things. There are other ways of dealing with it. So there is still an option to stay anonymous from start to finish. But yeah, the response might be less effective, but there's still things people can do.
Yeah, and you've got it on your radar. I mean, as compliance and HR, I mean, I genuinely think it's either you're in the dark or you allow anonymous complaints and you just can't do as much as you might like, but you still know something is happening. And I think that is invaluable.
Yeah.
The last question that we do have is from Stacy. And her question is, when using Spot as a reporting tool, are the complaints discoverable?
Are the complaints discoverable? As in, can you search them? Or
that's what I would think the question is being phrased as.
Should we assume it means that?
Okay, we'll assume it means that. So
legal. Legal.
Sorry?
Legal. So like in the context of the question,
yeah,
she's asking, are the complaints discoverable by legal? Like, members on the legal team.
Got it. So with Spot, with the system that we have working right now, at least, you can designate individuals as administrators on the dashboard, which is where your complaints are managed. So the most likely additional admins you want to add, at least temporarily, might be lawyers or people who are involved in complaints. And so effectively what you can do is you can add someone who has access to your whole reporting system, which gives them access to a specific report, and they can comment both in the system itself so that you have it all in one place, and they can download and see everything that's happened. So that's one way of communicating it. You can also download all Spot documents as a timestamped, securely signed PDF. So the whole file you can also share in whatever way you normally share it with other individuals, including your response. So there's also a PDF of what questions you sent to follow up, when you sent them, and it timestamps everything that you've done as well.
Hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, hopefully that was the right answer to the right question.
Yeah, and I can see here on my end that Stacy loves that answer. So thank you. I think we have time for one more question. We're coming up on the top of the hour here, and the last question is from Keenis. And the question is, what research or work have you identified concerning using audio or video to record all staff interaction?
I haven't done any research on that.
Research? Yeah, we haven't done any research on that. I know that there are some tools, there's certainly some companies who are playing with that right now, with doing things like identifying male voices and female voices and seeing how many interruptions happen, trying to essentially tackle the fact that, unfortunately, in many organizations, men are much more likely to speak up in meetings, and they're much more likely to interrupt or belittle or restate something a woman has said in their own words and take the credit. So there's problems around implicit assumptions that probably are driving that, and sort of sexism that also has to do with sort of structures and how meetings work and the maleness of the workplace that some of us work in. But actual academic research?
I don't know any. What we could do, though, because we'll be open to questions afterwards, we could actually look into that.
Yeah.
And if we can find anything, we might find a way of reaching out. But I don't know any.
I don't know any. And the only people I've talked to who are working on this tech, it's all behind closed doors because I think they'd quite like to sell it. So I'm not sure how keen they are to contribute to the wider academic literature on this. But if there is anything, I'll post it on my Twitter. You can come follow me there if you really want. But other than that, we'll look into it. But I'm not aware of anything.
Awesome. So I believe that's all the time that we had for today. I think we shared a bunch of exciting and interesting content today about actually like how to, again, help employees speak up about inappropriate behavior at work. Because the problem is just to create like a safer place for people and to help HR teams be proactive, to reduce the time it takes for HR to help and be more of an ally for their employees. You could request a demo at talktospot.com/teams. And again, myself or Julia will be more than happy to give you a deeper dive into how we're using AI to help employees speak up about workplace harassment and discrimination. So again, thank you for myself for joining us today. I really had a lot of fun with you all today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.